Hi, I'm Greg Scott, author of Bullseye Breach, an IT security educational book disguised as a thriller about how Russian criminals invade the IT network of fictional retailer Bullseye stores to steal 40 million customer credit card numbers. Trust on the internet is as much about psychology as technology, and it's not as straightforward as you might think. Everyone who uses the internet, which is pretty much everyone these days, needs to know how trust works. During his 2016 New Year's Eve vacation in Florida, President Donald Trump held court in front of the TV cameras, and he talked about the election and whether or not the Russians interfered. The quotes also showed up in the New York Times on New Year's Day 2017, page A10. Here's what he said. And I know a lot about hacking, and hacking is a very hard thing to prove, so it could be somebody else. And I also know things that other people don't know, and so they can't be sure of the situation. Yeah, right, Donald. I'm as much of an expert on New York real estate as you are with computer hacking. Here's some more of what Donald had to say. I don't care what they say. No computer is safe. I have a boy who's 10 years old. He can do anything with a computer. You want something to really go without detection, write it out and have it sent by courier. Donald. I need to thank you for giving me great material to work with. You do realize the good guys nailed Osama bin Laden because we followed his courier, right? You might want to attend some of those intelligence briefings and learn about this stuff. And that leads to the first thing we should all remember about trust on the internet. Learn the basics. This might save you from making a fool out of yourself. It's Literacy 101, and right now our U.S. national leaders look like the Three Stooges. We have to do better. Here's the issue we need to deal with. Alice wants to talk to Bob. Now, maybe Bob is Alice's bank, or maybe Bob's an online retailer, or maybe he's just some guy named Bob. But Bob is on the other side of the internet. So how does Alice know that this entity claiming to be Bob really is Bob? And how do they communicate privately across a public medium like the internet? We need some theory for this to make sense, and there's no getting around it. You don't need to be a computer scientist, but you do need to know a few things. You need to know what encryption is, you need to know what the public key infrastructure is all about, and you need to know why digital certificates are important. It's kind of like when you had to learn about street signs when you took your driver's training. I promise it won't hurt. First up is encryption. The principles haven't changed one bit since Roman days. Here's an example message with a Caesar cipher. A Caesar cipher just means you go up and down some number of letters in the alphabet, and for every letter of the message, and substitute. So in this case, the key is 1. So if you wanted to send the message, crypto is cool, using a Caesar cipher with a key of 1, here's what it would look like. See how we substitute D for C and S for R and so on down the line? So we have a message that ends up looking like gibberish, but it's not. The thing to remember here is all encryption starts with plain text. Apply an algorithm with an encryption key to produce ciphertext and send your message. Decryption is just the opposite. Simple, not a big deal, right? Now today's keys use 512 or even 1024 bits, and that number will get even bigger as computers get more powerful. Here's what a 512-bit number looks like in decimal without the commas. 155 digits. That's a lot of digits. So let's say Alice has a plain text message, she has an algorithm, and she has a key. Alice needs to send an encrypted message to Bob. How does Bob get the key so he can decrypt Alice's message? That's another challenge that's been around for a long time. Well, enter Ralph Merkle, Whitfield Diffie, and Martin Hellman, and they came up with a slick solution way back in 1977. Today it's called a Diffie-Hellman exchange, and with a little practice, you and a partner can use the same concept to freak people out at a party. Here's what you do. In a room full of people, trade random numbers with your partner in front of the whole room and with everyone else listening and watching. Or even better, Have somebody at random give you and your partner those first two seed numbers. Now you each do a calculation with the numbers you just received, and then you and your partner trade the numbers you came up with. Again, do that in front of everyone. No funny stuff. Do another calculation, and this time you'll both come up with the same result. That number is your shared key. The two of you know it, but nobody else does, even though they all listen to you trade the same numbers. How's that for slick? Now this is where you freak everybody out. At the end, each of you write down your final result on a piece of paper and show it to the crowd. The crowd will go wild when they all see that both of you came up with the same number. Don't worry about Diffie-Hellman details for now. You can look those up on the internet, and I might do another mini seminar on how it works if there's interest. Also, remember that Diffie-Hellman is great for coming up with a common key value, but it does nothing to verify that Bob really is Bob. It's one thing when you're in that room looking at your partner. It's a whole different ballgame for Alice and Bob with the internet in between. We need PKI, or public key infrastructure, for that. PKI uses a principle called asymmetric encryption. It means you encrypt with one key and decrypt with a different key. That sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? Would you believe an entire industry sprang up around that concept? Here's the idea. Now that you have two keys, you make one key public and you keep the other one private. This is a big deal. Let's say somebody wants to send you a private message. Anyone out there can encrypt the message with your public key and send it over. You decrypt it with your private key, and that's how anyone can start a private conversation with you. PKI algorithms are computationally intensive, which means they use a lot of computer horsepower, so we don't use them for ongoing conversations. We just use them to set up. Now this is also huge. With PKI, you can digitally sign documents by encrypting your signature with your private key, just like signing a piece of paper. You send out the encrypted document to the world, and anybody can decrypt it with your public key. That's how they know the document came from you. It's kind of like handwriting analysis on the internet, or maybe the wax seal imprinted by the king if you're still into couriers. Which leads to digital certificates. Meet Cathy. Everyone trusts Cathy to sign special documents called digital certificates by encrypting them with her private key. Cathy is a certificate authority, or CA, and she makes money by signing certificates. Think of a CA as kind of like a department of trust, but CAs are private businesses, not government agencies. So let's say Bob buys a certificate from Cathy, and Bob shows that certificate to Alice. When Alice decrypts Bob's certificate and compares it to an original plaintext copy, Alice will trust what it says because she can verify that Cathy signed it. We need one more player in this drama. Meet Melvin, the man in the middle. This is where we cue the evil guy music. He has shifty eyes and he looks like an old cartoon character. Melvin wants to disrupt the dialogue between Alice and Bob. Maybe he wants to steal money. Maybe he just wants to spy on either party. But he's a very real threat, and security professionals lose lots of sleep over him. By the way, Melvin is not always a bad guy. There are popular applications that take advantage of a man in the middle. We can't call it an attack because that's how these apps are written. File sharing is one example, so is Skype. But for this discussion, Melvin is always a bad guy. Now we're ready to put it all together. Consider this dialogue between Alice and Bob. Alice starts out when she says, "Hi, Bob," and Bob says, "Hi, Alice." Then Alice asks Bob, "Please transfer $100 from my checking account to my savings account, and here's my password." So Bob takes care of it, and he comes back and acknowledges it. "No problem, Alice, it's done." And Alice says, "Thanks, Bob." And Bob says, "You're welcome, Alice, and thanks for banking with Bob." Simple, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, now let's look what happens when Melvin gets in the middle. I color-coded the players so you can see who says what in my thrilling, suspenseful dialogue. Alice only wants to move $100 from her checking account to her savings account. But Melvin inserts himself in the middle of the conversation, and Melvin fools Bob into sending Melvin everything in Alice's checking account. Alice won't be happy when she finds out later that she's broke, and Bob won't like the harm to his reputation. So, how does Bob keep Melvin out of the middle of this dialogue? Well, here's how it works. Every year, Bob pays Cathy to send him a new certificate attesting that Bob really is Bob. Alice can verify it by checking Cathy's digital signature. Well, what about Alice? How do we know that Alice really is Alice? We could force Alice to buy a certificate for all of her devices, just like Bob, but nobody does that. We mostly use digital certificates to verify banks and other online services, not consumers. Alice knows Bob should be able to show her a certificate. So before Alice shares anything sensitive with Bob, like her bank account number, Alice first makes sure that Bob's certificate has the proper signature from Cathy. And Melvin can't get in on this action. The whole system depends on trust. Both Alice and Bob trust that Cathy will never send a copy of Bob's certificate to Melvin. They also both trust that Cathy will never share her private key because that would allow everyone in the world to impersonate Cathy. And that leads to two questions. How does Cathy set herself up in a position of trust like that? And what happens if she does mess up her position of trust? By the way, CAs are prime cyber attack targets. You'd think they would be leaders in cyber defense. Well, on that first question, earning a position of trust, Cathy does it by convincing the web browser manufacturers to trust her. So when Alice visits Bob's website and Bob sends back a certificate signed by Cathy, Alice's browser looks for Cathy in its list of trusted CAs. If Cathy is in that list, and if all the other fields in that certificate check out, then Alice's browser trusts it. Otherwise, Alice's browser sends an invalid certificate warning back to Alice, and now Alice needs to make a decision. Now check this out, right here. This is the heart of why this stuff confuses people. You have to remember your characters. There's 4 of them. Alice is a consumer, Bob is a service provider, Cathy is a trusted CA, and Melvin is the evil man in the middle. Keep track of your characters, maybe play this back a couple times, and it all makes sense. Here's an example of what that invalid certificate error looks like. I took this screenshot from a typical home internet router and I used the Firefox web browser because Firefox gives me usable information about the warning so I can make a good judgment call on what to do about it. If you see one of these from your banking website or from an online retailer, it means your browser found a problem with the certificate. Your browser doesn't trust it. You probably shouldn't either. But if you see this warning from, say, a cheap home internet router like where this came from, it might not be as big a deal. I just noticed this. Look closely at that warning. It says this certificate expired way back in 2006. Maybe I should do another mini seminar about securing home internet connections. Also notice the HTTPS I highlighted at the beginning of the URL string. HTTPS is just a protocol that says my browser wants to see your certificate and wants to encrypt our messages. HTTPS is not a guarantee of safety by itself, but it's a fundamental component. What happens if Cathy does violate her trust? The short answer is nothing good. Everyone who trusts Cathy is now at risk. Imagine what might happen if Cathy secretly sells Bob's certificate to Melvin. Well, then Melvin could impersonate Bob and nobody would know the difference until it was too late. Even worse, imagine Melvin stealing Cathy's private key. Now Melvin could impersonate Cathy and issue his own certificates all over the place. And there's more risk. With hundreds of CAs in the real world, and with many of those CAs delegating trust to still other CAs, attackers have lots of targets to go after. At best, it's a mess when a CA falls down on the job. At worst, it could be a global disaster. This isn't just hypothetical. Lots of CAs have been penetrated over the years. This slide shows a few examples. Just do a Google search for Certificate Authority cyber attacks and you'll find more references. So does that mean the system is broken? Some say yes. Others take a more nuanced stance. Everyone agrees the system is not perfect, though, but there's no widespread agreement on how to fix it or how to replace it with something better, which is really no different than using couriers if you think about it. What do consumers like Alice do about all this? Well, number one, proceed with your eyes open. Remember that HTTPS is just a protocol. Don't believe all the advice that tells you it's a guarantee of safety. The system is not as foolproof as online vendors want you to believe, but it's not as bad as many sensationalists scream. For what it's worth, I've been shopping online since 1999, and I'm a credit card fraud victim myself, but I run into more trouble from poorly built websites than anything else. You need to know about one other popular attack vector. It's called DNS poisoning, and it has a few components, and I'm going to do another mini seminar about this. First, an attacker builds a website that looks like the login screen of your banking website, or maybe your favorite retailer or some other service provider. Next, the attacker figures out a way to change your translation for the IP address, say www.bobsbank.com, to the attacker's IP address. To pull this off properly, he also needs to infiltrate a CA and steal a certificate for his website that looks legitimate. Once he sets all that up, when Alice goes to what she believes is Bob's banking website, she actually ends up on Melvin's fake website. She enters her login credentials, and Melvin's website says they're no good. And now Melvin owns Alice. By the time Alice figures out she's been hoodwinked, it's too late. By then, Melvin or one of his buddies has already drained all of her bank accounts and charged up her credit cards to the max and maybe taken out a mortgage on an expensive property in the Caribbean. Does that sound too elaborate, too cloak and dagger for the normal world? Well, it's not. This kind of stuff happens all the time. Heed the advice about keeping your devices clean, and see my mini-seminar about phishing schemes for more. What if you're in Bob's shoes? What if you're a service provider? What do you do about it then? Well, some banks ask consumers to select an image when consumers set up their profiles. So then when the consumer starts to log on, the bank displays an image as an assurance that the bank website really belongs to the bank. If Alice is at Melvin's fake website, Melvin won't know what image to display. So then Alice should be able to see right away she's at the wrong website. This is a nice theory, but it depends on consumers being sharp enough to spot it, and most aren't. But maybe now you will be. Other service providers are implementing two-factor authentication, and this is a good thing. When you log in from a new computer, the bank sends a text message to your cell phone with a code. Enter the code into the website to log in. This verifies you're you to the bank. Some software companies no longer trust public CAs, and they sign their own certificates instead. But browsers don't list these software companies as CAs, so accessing their websites trigger errors. And this forces Alice to apply a judgment call instead of just closing down websites that present certificate errors. One thing's for sure, there are no universal answers. Beware of one-size-fits-all checklists. I need to leave you with one final warning. Buy your copy of Bullseye Breach today, but don't start reading it until a Friday afternoon, because once you start, you won't be able to put it down. So this gives you the whole weekend to recover from jet lag after you're up all night Friday reading. And if you like what you read, please leave me a nice review on Amazon and all the other online review sites. Authors use these reviews to build credibility so we can keep writing. And thanks for putting up with my amateur narration.